Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada supports the latest U.S. action in Iran.
Canada's position on the developments in the Middle East remains clear. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the principal source of instability and terror throughout the Middle East. It has one of the world's worst human rights records and must never be allowed to obtain or develop nuclear weapons. Canada supports the United States acting to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and to prevent its regime from further threatening international peace and security.
To take a closer look at what the Prime Minister had to say, I'm joined now by Bob Rae, Canada's former ambassador to the UN. Thank you very much for joining us today, Mr. Rae. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced that Canada does support the American military action targeting Iran. Do you think that's the right move for the Canadian Prime Minister?
Well, I think the Prime Minister's statement, you need to add to that, I think, the comments that the Minister of Foreign Affairs made over the last 24 hours, where she made it very clear, and so did Mr. Carney, that Canada is not a party to this at the moment. Canada is not militarily involved, and we're not engaged in that way. And I think the kind of focus which the government will now be moving to is to look at what can we do diplomatically to try to find a way out the other end of this. Their regime change from 50,000 feet is not something that happens. And I do think it has to be clear that even the effort to find a solution by bombing alone, the Americans and the Israelis tried that 7 months ago, and that didn't work. So we're going to have to find a way through international institutions like the Atomic Energy Agency and others to find ways to make sure that Iran will agree to a monitoring of whatever activities it has with regard to nuclear energy, and to make sure that Iran doesn't build a bomb and that they're not capable of building a bomb. That will require diplomacy and, frankly, international law and legality as much as anything else. And so we've got to be thoughtful about this as we go forward. Canada's role, since we're not a military party to this, has to be talking with other countries about how we can find a longer term, more secure, better solution to the current security crisis than the one that has been going on.
I was going to say, what sort of role is there a role for Canada as a middle power being involved sort of on the diplomacy front for Canada to play? Is there a role for Canada to play in this moment with that in context?
Well, absolutely. Not alone. I mean, Canada's not going to do this alone, but Canada needs to be looking at how can we together through the G7, through other countries in the region with whom we have very strong relationships. How can we create a frame that says, okay, what do you think the end game is? And it's something we have to say to both our American friends as well as to the Israelis and others. This conflict is spreading. It has the potential to cause substantial economic damage if the Straits of Hormuz are closed. Oil won't be getting out. Oil prices have already jacked up. And a regime that is cornered and is hit as badly as it has been over the last couple of days is not a regime that's likely to do anything than just fire back as desperately and as strongly as they possibly can. And so we do have to understand the risks that are being run when you start a war in the way in which this one has been started, and understand that it is going to be challenging to get us to a situation when we can talk about, what does a victory look like? How quickly could a change in government take place realistically? The people of Iran have no guns. They have no arms. They have no missiles. They have no drones. They have almost no military capacity. And there's 30,000 principally young women and men who've been killed in the streets over the last several months. And I know people say, well, now that the bombing has started and the supreme leader is dead and his whole team is dead, That gives us great cause for hope. Well, strategy without resources is not called hope. It's called hallucination. We need to understand what it actually takes to do the tough things that people talk in very loud language about what they want to do. The reality is getting Iran's military nuclear capacity, the capacity of its missiles, down and under control is something that requires agreement from those people who are in positions to enforce an agreement. How do you get there? Right now, we're far away on all sides. But I think it would be no question that Canada doesn't think Iran should have a nuclear weapon. That's where we signed the Anti-Proliferation Treaty. We believe that other countries should not be getting into the nuclear business. We want to restrict the spread of nuclear weapons, not augment nuclear weapons. But we also need to understand that solutions have to be found that ultimately have a chance of succeeding. The obliteration tactic was used 7 months ago. Normally, when something is obliterated, it stays obliterated for a little longer than 7 months. So we've got to understand that a purely military solution is not likely to have a long-term lasting impact on the region of a positive kind. And we're beginning to see the depth of the ferocity of the response that's coming from both sides. And you need to ask yourself the question, is this really going to produce a solution that's going to make us all more secure?
I want to pick up on a couple of things you said in that answer there. First of all, you sort of mentioned, what do you think the end game is here based on what you've heard from Donald Trump so far, based on what you've heard from Benjamin Netanyahu so far? What do you think the end game is? And in the context of part of that answer where you sort of suggested you're unclear whether there's a long-term plan here besides the immediate, can you sort of expand upon that?
Well, reporters have to be very careful not to ask me to expand too much because I'll keep you here. I'll keep you here for a couple of hours, Katie. Let me just be brief. I believe honestly that the end game in the minds of I saw Pete Hegseth's statement this morning. Have listened to just about everything President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have said. I understand completely that for Israel, there is a powerful desire to defang the capacity of Iran to wreak havoc on the Israeli people. I understand that completely. But you have to ask yourself, is a purely military solution going to produce this? Is that what is going to produce the security that Israel needs and wants? We all want Israel to be secure. And we also, by the way, want the Palestinian people to have their own country. So those are things that we need to keep in our uppermost in our minds as we look at what is it going to take to get to a solution that's going to provide for greater security for all the people in the region. As far as the United States is concerned, I hear two things. One is obviously to disempower any nuclear or missile capacity of Iran, which has been the position of the U.S. for a very long time. Well, they negotiated that under President Obama, and then President Trump tore up what had been negotiated and said there will be no negotiation. And so the result is finding a military solution. As I said, they tried the obliteration tactic, hasn't worked. This is not like mowing the lawn. It has serious consequences for human life. And civilian life, let's remember, has been lost on both sides and will continue to be lost, and on all sides as this conflict potentially spreads. So the talk of regime change is another story. We all would love to see a democratic, pluralistic Iran, but you have to continue to ask yourself the question, how is that going to happen? It isn't going to happen as a result of a bombing campaign from the air, and the willingness on the part of nation states to engage in a boots on the ground strategy in Iran is not going to work. Look at what happened in Iraq. Look at what happened in Afghanistan. We have to learn some lessons for how we deal with countries that are facing this level of extremism and this level of terrible governance and terrible treatment of women and denial of human rights. We went into Afghanistan thinking we were fighting for for freedom and for better governance, and we ended up with the Taliban back again. So we've got to be careful to learn from mistakes and also to learn some common sense lessons. There's no evidence anywhere in history of a country being bombed into regime change from 50,000 feet. It doesn't happen. Even people would say to me, well, what about Japan at the end of the Second World War? And you say, well, first of all, I don't think anybody's talking about a nuclear strategy. But secondly, don't forget the Americans had to fight mile by mile and other allies going from island to island to island for 3.5, 4 years before the war was finally in a position to be ended by the dropping of 2 nuclear bombs. So this is difficult, painful stuff. And I really worry that we're raising hopes, creating expectations, which frankly, I don't think either the United States or the Israelis have the capacity or the willingness, frankly, to take it on to that extent. And even then, we have to understand regime change is a very difficult thing to do. And I'm not opposed to it. In fact, I'm in favor of it. I'd love to see the regime changed in Iran, but I don't think we should be holding out an objective that is going to be incredibly difficult to achieve without an extraordinary loss of life.
Former Ambassador Ray, thank you very much for your insight and analysis today.
Well, thank you, Katie. I'm sure it'll get me into the trouble that I usually get into, but thank you very much.
Thanks.